Bon matin ou bon après-midi tout le monde et merci de votre participation aujourd'hui. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Chloé Roussel and I'm pleased to have joined CRDCN as Director of Communications and Engagement. Je m'appelle Chloé Roussel, j'ai le privilège d'être la directrice des communications et de l'engagement du RCCDR. Vous êtes des centaines de participants à avoir répondu à notre appel afin de mettre en œuvre une initiative importante pour mettre en contact les chercheurs avec les spécialistes des données et des politiques publiques pour qu'ensemble nous puissions répondre aux enjeux essentiels. Nous espérons que cet événement vous incitera à continuer à porter main forte aux efforts d'analyse et d'engagement reliés à la COVID-19. Bien que ce webinaire se déroule en anglais, un résumé bilingue sera disponible dans les semaines à venir. Vous êtes aussi invités à poser vos questions dans la boîte de questions dans la langue officielle de votre choix. It is now my pleasure to introduce CRDCN's Executive Director, Martin Taylor, who is the moderator for today's panel.
Thank you, Chloe. The CRDCN and Statistics Canada truly welcome this opportunity to convene and connect colleagues during this extraordinary time in our country's history. We're delighted that there's been such a positive response to this webinar series, reflected in the large numbers participating in each session, including today. As Chloe mentioned, we trust that this event will inspire you to continue to inform crucial analysis and action taking place in communities across the country. This series is about connecting colleagues and ideas for the common good. It's also about leveraging our collective ingenuity and about bridging gaps and overcoming limitations together by focusing on the art of the possible. This is a special year for the CRDCN as we celebrate our 20th anniversary, and it's particularly appropriate, therefore, to thank CFI, CHR, SSHRC, Statistics Canada, university partners from across the country, as well as provincial government and private sector partners for their ongoing support, without which none of our efforts would be possible. We're really delighted to welcome as our panelists today, Monica Boyd, Jesslyn Thibodeau, Li Zhu, and Ted Mcdonald, who each have valuable insights to share from their respective vantage points on immigration and settlement issues in the context of COVID-19. Our panelists will speak for 5 minutes about how the COVID-19 pandemic informs the research questions to be asked, the data that can be brought to bear to address them, and the ways we can come together across geography, disciplines, and sectors to inform Canada's efforts. Panelists will then respond to questions submitted at the time of your registration or today. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box during the 4 presentations. Regardless of whether your questions get asked, they will provide valuable insight to inform CRDCN's and our panelists' efforts going forward. So without any further delay, let me invite Monica Boyd, Professor of Sociology and one of our leading researchers in Canada on immigration, to share her opening comments. Monica, please.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking CRDCN for hosting these 5 popular webinars in the time of COVID, and congratulations for an excellent selection of speakers from various policy, data analytics sides, and public sector academic sides. It's been a privilege to be part of this. I'm going to begin by commenting that my jumping off point is going to be what I call old wine and new bottles, because the COVID has actually been, as everyone has been saying, quite revolutionary and has forced us to return to some of the older issues that are there, but also to rethink them in new ways. One of the issues that is well known in almost every article, particularly on the economic integration of migrants, begins with is, it is well known that there are subpopulations that are more affected than others within the immigrant population. They're more affected in terms of getting COVID. We've seen this with the older groups in general. We have seen compromised physical health by some groups lead to a greater risk of catching the disease. Poverty, crowded living conditions, those with limited access to information. Recent immigrants, visible minority immigrants, those who are less well integrated, those who have less knowledge about digital contact, those who are not fluent in official languages and therefore not likely to hear information where relevant or to perhaps become confused by it. I have some thoughts on that because I think what the conflict today is going to force us to do is to get deeper into the issue where we are not simply running what I call a main effects regression model, where we have a model for visible minorities, we have a variable for women, we have a variable for not having an official language capacity, etc. I think we are really at a stage where these particular statuses become multiple statuses and interact with each other. That has implications particularly for the long term. In the immediate term, it definitely creates real marginality for certain combination of these groups. For the remainder of my talk, however, what I want to do is to focus on one subpopulation among the many, while recognizing again that there are multiple statuses concatenated into this. And I want to begin with the observation that throughout COVID, and it's been said by others, that gender really matters. Gender has been less on the table as a research topic. It's always there. People are very good at running analyses with men and women for the most part. But I think we are back again, old wine in new bottles, where a sustained look at some of the gender implications of COVID would be well worthwhile. We've heard terms like she recession. We've heard concerns that being at home will lead to a triple day, the role overload, child raising, home maintenance, emotional labor all seem to be done by women more than men. And intimate partner violence is an issue in certainly by many settlement communities that are working with groups on the ground. And in my own research, gender certainly trumps immigrant status. What I mean by that is the major divide, even within the Canadian-born population and within the immigrant population, is gender. The major divide is not immigrant versus non-immigrant. Gender has its own particular displays, and we've seen it in particular with the labor force concentration of women in some occupations and not in others. Most succinctly, gender in an interaction with immigration status creates what's called a double advantage. If you do any kind of comparisons crisscrossing immigrant status and gender, it's immigrant women who are usually doing worse, whether it has to do with what kinds of occupations they're in, less so unemployment, curiously enough, but definitely with earnings. And I think we need to return to this in two ways. We talked yesterday about the education of children, and in particular, in the past two sessions, we talked about the importance of getting a sense of who is going to be scarred by COVID as it acts out over the next 2 years or so. One of the questions that I want to see is what is happening to girls versus boys when they make this transition in these troubled times, particularly if they're from immigrant families. There are some reasons for this. Immigrants have passionately embraced education. They've embraced it surprisingly for some groups that come from fairly male-dominated societies. For women, the rationale seems to be that it makes them more marriageable, that they will, and then for some it also makes them more economically secure. But what happens when schooling is more interrupted, when parents may not be able to fill the gap? Do we find different expectations for girls versus boys in those kinds of situations? And I think we do need a longitudinal study of some kind that picks up this important transition that's been commented about by other individuals. The other way we see gender is who is affected. We know that from Stats Canada data that immigrants tend to be in those jobs that require face-to-face interactions and that cannot be done from home, immigrant women in particular. So they are vulnerable again to job loss in a way that is less true for the Canadian-born female population. And where we really see this, and we see the discussion of the importance of gender, although it's at the margins, but it's really their central stage, is my point, is what is the health of the care sector and who is working in this sector. There's a significant segment of the immigrant population who are women and who are in care. And they are not only there as doctors and as nurses, but they're also there in what are the more problematic occupations, as we've seen from the news that's carried. The proportion of adult immigrants, not 1.5, which often is added into the figures, the proportion of adult immigrants who were home workers rose between 1991 from 18% of the population to 33% in 2016. If we add people who arrived between 0 and 19 years of age, 40% of home aides are migrants, are migrant women. I should say 40% of 40% of women, sorry, of the aides are migrant women. And we also see this as true for essentially caregivers of children. We see this for nurses' aides, which is also not considered to be a good job. And again, we've got personal testimony from many of the frontline workers as to the stresses and strain. There also is a tremendous loss of talent in these fields, in these medical fields, that analysts like Feng Ho at Stats Canada addressing the COVID crisis has documented, where he notes that 48% of the population that is trained in health, that has a post-secondary degree trained in health, is essentially not working in care, compared to 28% of the Canadian-born. He does a gender analysis, but not what I think we need to do, which is an immigrant-gender analysis. You know, what are the implications? Well, there's another. Well, I'll try to cut here because I know I'm running over. There's a short-term concern, which is, and it's being voiced now, which is what to do about the bad working conditions that many of these immigrant caregivers are facing. There is evidence of the studies that have been done, including my own research, that many of the nurses' aides, many of the people who are working in long-term care have experienced downward mobility. They're actually trained as nurses, but they're working in jobs that are far less likely to be commensurate with their training. And I think this calls for a renewed look of what can be done to better capture that talent. Clearly, there's going to be a greater awareness of long-term care. We could have a seminar on that alone. But what I really want to stress is that when things settle down, we have to be prepared to dive more deeply into the data than we have done as research analysts, in the hopes that it is informing public policy more specifically and leading not to just a study of immigrants, but also to a study of immigrant men, immigrant women, and immigrants in certain key critical occupations like the healthcare sector, because that sector, certainly with the aging of the population, is going to be increasing. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Monica. And that's a perfect segue, I think, to turn now to Jesslyn Thibodeau. Jesslyn is the Assistant Director of Settlement and Integration Policy at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada. So Jesslyn, please share your thoughts with us.
Hi, I'd just like to echo Monica and thanking you for holding this webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts. The first thing that I'm going to do, also first off, Tracy Donaldson also sends her regrets. She wasn't able to make it today. As you can imagine, there's a lot of things going on at IRCC that require a lot of meetings. So hope you'll suffer through me as her replacement. I will give a quick overview of the settlement program that IRCC runs, just in case anyone is unfamiliar with it. So IRCC provides services, funds organizations to provide services like information orientation, needs and asset assessments and referrals, employment services, community connections, and of course language assessment and language training services as well. We serve eligible clients who are permanent residents that arrive in Canada, and so we have a wide swath of clients. It can be an economic principal applicant who arrives with a job and who already speaks one of the official languages, to someone who maybe has a lower literacy level, even in their own kind of mother tongue. So we have a very wide swath of clients. We also rely on our amazing third-party partners for service delivery. So service provider organizations are funded to deliver these services on behalf of IRCC. Some of them deliver all of the services, some deliver different mixes of the services depending on what's required in their community and with the client base. So like I mentioned, partnerships are really key to our delivery. Not only the SPOs, but we do co-planning with provinces and territories. And internally within IRCC, we have our research and evaluation colleagues and our chief data officer branch colleagues who help us conduct research and evaluations on our programs, and also manage the huge amount of data that we have at our disposal at IRCC around these programs and newcomers in general. So some of the questions that we're grappling with right now from a policy perspective, in our new world, we have obviously had to move and pivot quite quickly to an online service delivery platform where possible. So some of the things that are coming up around that in particular are, how do we avoid those who are already a vulnerable population, how do we avoid them falling through the cracks further without kind of like a daily or weekly check-in from a worker at an organization? So what can we do there? And also, how do we know which clients and services are best suited to alternative service delivery? There is a certain subpopulation for which online service delivery might work better. For example, someone who does shift work or has another full-time job. It might be difficult for them to get to an organization within the working hours. It might also, you know, someone who has caregiving duties, it might be difficult for them to go into an organization in person. So there are some opportunities here to maybe better serve some clients who have trouble going into a physical organization. And that being said, there's always other populations who might be disadvantaged by the online world. So some, you know, may not have access to the technology or the internet that's required, broadband that's required in order to access the services in a meaningful way. So what we're also looking at is what approaches and what partnerships will enable us to really follow clients and newcomers in general over time. And we're working on nurturing some of our existing partnerships that we have with all across kind of the spectrum of society to make sure that we're co-planning and we're really being respectful of everybody's time. We don't want to get into a situation where organizations are being asked the same question by a lot of different types of researchers. So we're trying to be really respectful and mindful of the time of organizations who are dealing with this crisis and co-plan with our existing partners. We also want to make sure that we have evaluations and assessments, other performance measurement tools in place so that we don't miss this opportunity that we have and the responsibility that we have to learn from the situation we are in right now and course correct as we go. In the longer term, how do we know which services and clients are best suited to the delivery? Where can we free up some resources in terms of funding or staff in order to maybe better serve the other subpopulations that are more vulnerable and maybe require some more intensive service delivery? In the longer term, things that we're looking at or things that we will be looking at is, and Monica touched on this as well, the essential services, people who work in essential jobs. We know that a lot of those people are newcomers. What do the economic outcomes of those newcomers look like? What do our employment services look like in a world where certain jobs now have kind of different essential requirements? And of course, similar in my head to kind of the Syrian cohort of refugees, there's going to be a cohort of people who became permanent residents in Canada maybe at the beginning of 2020, and what happens to them in the long term, and how if and how they differ from other newcomers who have come at other points in time, to try to get a sense of what the impact on this population in the short, medium, and long term really was. And that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Jesslyn. So can I now turn, Lee Zhu, to you? Lee is the Director of the Social Analysis and Modelling Division at Statistics Canada. And Lee, we look forward to your perspective. Lee, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So as I definitely echo what just Monica and Jesslyn said. So the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the way we live and work in every aspect. So today I just want to maybe highlight 3 points. The first, the key trends related to immigration prior to the COVID outbreak. And then so talk about some of the immediate impacts actually immigrants already felt. And then I'll talk about some of the longer term issues and also concerns right now in discussion, like within StatsCan. So first, so in terms of key trends prior to COVID, we all know that before the pandemic, immigration to Canada, both permanent residents and also temporary foreign workers, has been increasing since 2000. So immigrants bring skills important to essential sectors of Canadian economy, addressing labor and skill shortages. So immigrants, but are also overrepresented in some groups, just like Monica just mentioned, that are likely more vulnerable to the socio-economic and the health shocks of the pandemic. For example, low-income families and also those in precarious jobs, frontline workers, including those providing healthcare assistance in seniors facilities. And some groups of immigrants have been more vulnerable to past economic downturns from our previous research, such as recent immigrants and refugees. Looking at the immediate impacts, we noticed that at the onset of the pandemic, some sectors relying significantly on immigrants or temporary foreign workers felt negative impacts immediately, such as agriculture, food processing, due to disruptions of workers' inflows. The pandemic may also pose additional barriers for certain immigrants in terms of like getting the social support in this specific times. So for example, people unable to conduct a conversation in English or French when understanding information from public health authorities is crucial. And also those with low technical or ICT skills when everything is moving online nowadays. StatsCan has quickly focused its energies on releasing information and also innovative statistical tools to help a Canadian to better understand this new reality, including the labor force survey and also the web panel crowdsourcing apps. So new insights from the first web panel survey actually show immigrants are more concerned about their economic situation than the Canadian born. For example, concerns about losing jobs and also personal finances. Based on past impacts of economic recessions on immigrants, these concerns might be warranted. In fact, the latest labor force survey shows that employment among recent immigrants fell by 23% from February to April, compared with a decrease of 14% among the Canadian born. So the difference is partly related to recent immigrants' high concentration in some hard-hit industries, such as accommodation and food services. Immigrants have also expressed the greater concerns about social consequences than the Canadian born, such as concerns about civil disorder, maintaining social ties, ability to cooperate and to support each other during the crisis. So in addition to fast-track data collection, StatsCan has also launched a new COVID-focused analytical series to measure the short and longer-term impacts of COVID-19. This includes short articles released in a timely fashion, analyzing how the pandemic has reshaped the country's economy and also society including the study that Monica just mentioned, conducted by Fan Ho, looking at adults educated in health-related fields, but not working in a health occupation, and also temporary foreign workers and the labor shortages. And also right now, we are also looking at international students in the PSE programs, and also vulnerability in terms of immigrants and also visible minorities from multi-angle perspectives. So with labor force survey data collected in the coming months, StatsCan will conduct more detailed analysis on the early impacts of the pandemic on immigrants' labor market outcomes. More insights into the current and the evolving situation are also coming in the future waves of web panel and crowdsourcing surveys. So right now, actually, so we are looking at longer term concerns as the national context is being shifted towards reopening and the recovery. The focus of our data and also analysis is also shifting. While it is still too early to answer such questions as related to persistent impacts of the pandemic on immigrants, StatsCan has started to work with our partners on the inclusion of COVID-19 tax benefits into the IMDb to facilitate research and analysis on longer-term impacts and the effectiveness of government responses. Integrated analysis using administrative data along with other survey and also tax data will make it possible to study labor earnings trajectories when the economy recovers from the pandemic, and also shed light on implications for immigrants and their families in the many years to come after COVID. I'll stop here for now.
Well, thank you, Lee. And I think your comments echo those of your colleagues at previous webinars, where we're singularly impressed with the way in which Statistics Canada has turned on a dime, frankly, to generate new data, to think about ways to enhance existing data sets in order to address some of these key questions. So thank you for those insights. I'd now like to invite Ted Mcdonald to share his reflections. Ted is Professor of Economics at the University of New Brunswick. He also serves on our CRDCN board and chairs our academic council. Ted, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. So one of the disadvantages of going last is all the good ones were taken. So I'm going to hit a couple of common themes here around 4 issues that I think are important arising from COVID. But before I do, I'd like to kind of reframe those questions from a researcher perspective and just put a plug in for CRDCN that in partnership with Statistics Canada, we have the data infrastructure, we have the research capacity to handle these challenges and frame them as research questions, undertake them in a rigorous way, do the evaluation, do the impact analysis, and actually make policy recommendations. So we can take these challenges that our government colleagues have been raising, and we can answer those questions and help support policy going forward. So with that framework in mind, I'd like to talk just briefly about 4 issues that I think are important. The first is on international students. That, as we know, for those of us who are at universities, the impacts on the universities will have a significant effect on international students, their willingness to come here. All universities are exposed to some extent to international students that are dependent on them. Some are very much exposed to a reduction in international student numbers. But just as importantly for our provincial government in New Brunswick, and I'm sure this is the case in other provinces as well, is that international students provide a really important source of immigration, whether through the Canadian Experience class or through the provincial nominee program, that coming to New Brunswick, getting a degree, being a skilled immigrant, connecting maybe through the 2 or 3 year work visa with employer is an important source of immigrant retention in the smaller provinces. And this is going to be an issue that is going to be a challenge for our provincial government and other jurisdictions outside the Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver areas. From the student side, the students are going to see other options as potentially more attractive. So they may decide to study closer to home for lots of reasons that have become apparent with COVID. But also, if we are going to shift to more permanently a distance education model, then our smaller universities they may not be offering us a competitive as a program. It becomes a lot more competitive landscape. So the implications for our university sector, but also the smaller provinces in terms of immigrant inflows is going to be an issue. It was mentioned briefly about temporary foreign workers. Again, in New Brunswick, There is a heavy reliance on temporary foreign workers in the agricultural sector. Our provincial government announced a ban on temporary foreign workers, and then shortly after pushback from employers and farmers and they relaxed the ban. So aside from the labor market issues and the labor shortages that arise, temporary foreign workers can also supply potentially important group of provincial nominees. So I know some provinces have relied quite extensively on a pathway to permanent residency that comes through the temporary foreign worker pathway. The third issue, I think, and this was mentioned by a couple of other speakers, is on vulnerable populations. So we're really interested now, and so again, if I refer to New Brunswick, we've only had 122 cases of COVID in the entire province, but we have every single person who's been affected by the disruption of staying at home and the economic implications and the social implications. So for those vulnerable populations in particular, what are the implications of this wide disruption in terms of healthcare provision, in terms of education, in terms of provision of social services? And this is particularly the case for recent immigrants, especially refugees and visible minority immigrants who might be especially vulnerable. So if there are challenges more generally for the wider Canadian-born population to access services or to access them meaningfully, then the challenges for our more vulnerable populations are going to be significant. Also, IRCC mentioned about having to adapt settlement services, language training, social and cultural aspects of support that either IRCC provides directly or indirectly through the settlement services. The opportunity for us to evaluate what the impacts of this have been and then to help guide IRCC and others in terms of service delivery going forward. And the fourth one I'll mention, there's a wide labor market literature on what's called scarring effects. So immigrants or individuals who join the labor market in a time of recession, so there's research that suggests that there are permanent effects on their labor market outcomes. So this is an unprecedented national or natural experiment when we've got widespread disruption, we've got very high unemployment rates, we've got shocks to participation in the labor force. So this provides, it's a very serious situation for people entering the labor market, whether they're young people who are finished training or they're recent immigrants, but it's also a real opportunity to study the effects of this shutdown and the recession and the subsequent recovery on what are the longer term consequences of entering the labor market, trying to get work when conditions are so unfavorable to a lot of those recent entrants to the market. So Martin, I might stop there and we'll have lots of time for questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you all four for staying very much on schedule. So what we're going to do now, we're going to turn to questions. We have several questions, four I'm going to use in the first instance that were submitted in advance of today's session. So thank you for those who submitted questions in advance. And I'm going to start off, Lee, with a question that I think comes in your direction. What data are available to monitor how the pandemic influences immigrants' health and behaviors? You've touched on this, but if you could enlarge a little bit, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, this is actually a great question. And also we got very similar questions almost every day from everywhere across Canada. So, so I already briefly mentioned that StatsCan quickly launched the web panel survey and also the crowdsourcing apps in order to identify and also monitor specific issues on COVID impacts on Canadians. So here, as related to immigrants' health and behaviors, I want to highlight the web panel survey or the Canadian Perspective Survey Series, so CPSS. So because this specific survey is linked with the labor force survey, so that means that there's a immigrant flag actually, so you can identify immigration status and also years since landing. But the disadvantage of this, of course, is the sample size is not that big. So the sample is around 4,000. And currently 2 waves have been collected. Questions cover labor market impacts, for example, like labor activities since the COVID outbreak, and also health and behavior impacts, and food insecurity, and also mental health. So basic analysis is possible, like done by immigration status and also subgroups about health and behaviors or social and economic concerns. The forthcoming wave in June will be focusing on reopening of economic and social activities and the recovery. So I would encourage everyone interested in this, just stay tuned. And also the crowdsourcing, I know so many people are interested in this crowdsourcing new data source, but again, so there are concerns about the representativeness of the crowdsourcing data. But StatsCan, in order to balance the need for timely data and also the quality data, so launched this crowdsourcing since early April. Is collecting timely data on a wide variety of social, economic, health, and behavioral impacts of COVID-19. And there are certain advantages actually associated with crowdsourcing, so large sample. So our first wave actually got over 200K responses. Of course, it's not random design. So when researchers use this crowdsourcing data set, so probably we need to pay attention to, so not just make inference to the general population. And also another thing related to immigration identification in this crowdsourcing survey. So for the first wave, there's no immigrant flags on iteration 1, but since iteration number 2 and also onwards, immigration questions were added to the crowdsourcing. So so far, the crowdsourcing survey include questions on mental health and a wide variety of social concerns, and also public safety, PSE education, and also the newly launched fourth version of the crowdsourcing survey yesterday includes questions on trust in others, specifically in terms of willingness to get vaccinated and also perception towards the timing of reopening. So again, I use this opportunity again just to promote this crowdsourcing survey, especially the trust one. I think it will be a great info for provincial and also municipality in terms of identifying reopening strategies.
And Lee, can you just clarify when and how easily those data will be available?
Yeah, so the web panel, so right now, so StatsCan is making PONF, so the public use of microdata files available based on the web panel, but also the crowdsourcing data. And so the first wave of CPSS, the web panel PONF, is already available on STC's website. And the following waves will be made available very soon.
Okay, thanks very much. Excellent. Ted, I've got a question that probably comes in the first instance to you, and if there are others who want to contribute, please feel free after Ted has responded. What impacts, Ted, do you foresee for specific economic sectors in terms of demand for immigrant labour?
Sorry, I was on mute.
Ted, are you there?
Yeah, I was on mute. So effects on the labor market overall are well known. We've got spiking unemployment rate. We've got declining labor force participation rate. And we also, it's becoming more documented about the consequences of our income inequality. So the impacts on lower skilled jobs that can't be done from home, retail, meat packing, factory assembly, and also home care. So the demand certainly has been hit there. What the recovery will mean is anyone's guess. But I think there are also opportunities. So one that Monica mentioned is in terms of critical sectors, particularly healthcare. So we have a lot of immigrants with credentials in healthcare. Some of them have been quite rapidly drafted into providing healthcare services. And so I think in terms of that, there are opportunities, but more generally, I think immigrants are going to continue to be fundamental to the economic growth of Canada, not just the demographic side, but the economic growth, the innovation. And if we have, because of consequences of COVID, a re-examination, a shift to maybe more localized production or shorter supply chains or increased value added closer to home, then the innovativeness and the ingenuity and the entrepreneurship of skilled immigrants is going to be vital for us to be able to kind of reformat our economy and pivot to be able to respond to those kinds of challenges. So I think there are certainly issues around worsening inequality, but there are also I think quite pronounced opportunities in which we're going to rely heavily on immigration.
Okay, thanks, Ted. Did anyone want to add at all to that one? Okay, well then I'll move to the next question. Monica, this is coming primarily to you in the first instance again. We've largely focused, understandably, on issues related to immigrants who are already in Canada. Here's a question that goes a little differently. How might COVID-19 impact immigration to Canada? And the rider is, could, for example, economic uncertainty result, for example, in lower fertility, thus requiring more immigration even to sustain our population? Monica. Monica probably has to unmute.
Okay. I did what I was told. Can you hear me? No, you can't hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. All right. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, you can see me. All right, so we're good. Canada's fertility rate at the moment is 1.5, a little higher than that, but 1.5, meaning that a couple, if you assume that the world is divided into couples producing children, that they're not reproducing themselves. They're producing 1.5 of themselves. And this is a below replacement level. The real impetus for immigration, and it's in, I think, the policy statements, is for the economic contribution of migrants. So if the question is phrased, are we going to have conditions of labor scarcity in the future? First of all, it will be some 20 years from now when this 1.5 generation, this 1.5 fertility level grows up. That's quite different from saying in the immediate term, are we going to have to raise immigration? The answer, I think, to the more immediate term is no. The whole labor supply, and Ted is probably, as the economist in the group, and I think Lee is also trained as an economist, is that correct? Can probably answer this better, but there are all sorts of substitution effects. Prior to COVID, one of the things that was on the table was the spectra that we were all going to get replaced by robots, right? And there are some sectors where that can happen. And indeed, even in the healthcare field, there's sectors where that is happening already, particularly in terms of the heavy lifting that nurses and so on have to do with patients that are not able to help move themselves. The other thing that makes me say no is that from the point of view of replacing children who are not born because fertility levels are low, immigration has never been a good source for that. There are UN, starting in the mid-1990s, the United Nations Demography Division, Population Division, started a series of what would immigration bring to low fertility countries, particularly in Europe. And the answer was a resounding not very much. And one of the reasons is that you would have to have an incredible level of immigration that most countries really cannot begin to fathom, because it also means enormous quick diversification of the population. We're already highly diverse. That's a good thing about Canada. But can we really deal with 3 million people coming in a year? What will be the public reaction to that? And so these studies, and they continue to this day, really suggests that immigration cannot be a substitute for lost births. We are in a period of low fertility. Immigration is helping in the short term. Immigrants do get older themselves, so they also add to the healthcare needs of the elderly population later in life. It's a good question, it's a great question, but immigration isn't going to solve that.
Thanks, Monica. Anybody wanting to add to that one? Okay, we're going to move on then. Jesslyn, there's a question that came in advance that I think comes logically to you. What policy initiatives should be considered to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on immigrants' health and well-being? Again, you touched to some degree on this in your opening comments, but please feel free to enlarge.
Hi, I've unmuted myself, so we should be good.
Yep.
I think, yeah, I mostly already talked about some of the questions that we're already grappling with and looking at existing vulnerable populations and what type of further vulnerabilities might this COVID era bring about. And then also the potentially new vulnerable populations who can't access the online services or can't access services in this new environment as well, or have new or additional barriers in this new world. Something else that we have talked about a little bit further on, I mentioned earlier tracking this cohort of newcomers to see what happens in the longer term, but also what we're looking at is we know that, sense of belonging and all of those types of welcoming community initiatives, it will be really interesting and essential for us to track moving forward if COVID-19 affects how welcoming Canada is to newcomers, and how we kind of call it the two-way street between newcomers settling and integrating, as well as Canada being welcoming to newcomers, which we know has an effect and can have an effect on mental health and well-being.
Thank you. So that covers the questions that we were going to pose from the advance. I'm going to turn to Mike Beale, who's the academic director of our McMaster Research Data Center and again serves on our board. Mike, are there any questions that have come in while we've been in session?
I tried to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, and there's lots of questions, and so maybe we can get them done with some shorter answers. Let me just, the first one is going to go for Jesslyn. There were a number of questions, I doubt you'll be surprised, that had to do with policy, IRCC policy. So there were questions about whether there'd be an impact of COVID on family reunification, on the ability for undocumented immigrants to come into the labor force, and also whether IRCC was considering collecting information on race.
So I can speak to some of those questions. I work in settlement policy, and some of those questions are around more immigration selection policy, but I do know that there have been some interim measures put in place, at least during the current border closure or travel limitation situation, in order to allow certain things to still occur. In the longer term, it's still something that we are looking at in a constant way and engaging with our partners in our province and territory partners to try to look at what would happen going forward. And of course, lots of planning to figure out what happens after we are able to ramp up our processing to a full level again. In terms of the last question about data on race, this is something that we get a lot. And to be honest, it's above my pay grade about the type of data that we collect. Something like that would be on the application form for immigration. So it's kind of outside any sort of settlement type of question. But it is a good question, and I can definitely bring it back.
Thank you very much. To Ted because he raised it, but then I'm going to also ask Monica about it. There was a question, Ted raised the issue of foreign student enrollment. Do you expect the declining rate of foreign student enrollment to continue in the medium and the long term?
I think it depends a lot on the university's response. I think there will be a a shift more to looking closer to home. I know from some of our international students that, for example, the Chinese government is actively encouraging its students studying abroad to study closer to home. So I think we can no longer take as given that there will be an endless supply of international students as the market becomes more competitive. There still will be lots of people who want to travel to North America and Europe to upgrade their skills and get that level of education. But I think particularly for smaller universities, we cannot take this as given. We have to become more creative about the kind of program we offer. We have to really give a reason for students, especially if they're not going to be on site, why they should come and study at our universities. So it is an increasingly competitive market. I think this shock has hopefully has sort of shaken the universities out of maybe what was some complacence about the dependence on international students.
And Monica, would you have comments on that?
I can add to that. I think, you know, this is really a classic market formed by demand for a product, which is a university degree from Canada or from the United States or from a European country, and the supply. And typically what Ted is referring to in the Maritimes, I've seen firsthand, which is a certain segment of international students will not get into what are considered to be the larger universities, often seen as higher status for one reason or another. Usually it's the medical school that does it, not other fields. What I would expect would be some disruption in the traditional sorting that goes on where some international students show up physically and are where Ted is, and others show up physically at the University of Toronto. International students are well educated in what are the top universities. And what keeps them from getting their degrees from those universities is having to be physically on site and go through the selection system that the universities do require. If we have long distance learning where we start to approximate some of the horror stories that come out of the United States where anyone can supposedly hang up a shingle and issue a certificate of learning, there will be many students, for example, who will certainly try to stay closer to home or stay at home, and who will then try to get themselves onto the long distance learning certificates and diplomas that the universities that they think have greater cachet in their chosen field of study can provide. So I think we will see a massive redistribution. I think we will also see some decrease in the overall number of the international students. As Ted said, there is a segment that really does come from the experience. Many of them desperately want to learn English. They want to be fluent in English. They have career trajectories where they go back to their countries. They also have career trajectories where they stay here, right? You can't necessarily transform your status so quickly from being an international student to a permanent resident if you've effectively done a long distance learning degree. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Monica. So I will ask a question of Lee now about availability. The question is, what can be done to provide provincial governments with more text file microdata than is currently available? And the questioner lists examples of more fields in temporary visa data and also outcome data like the IMDb and iCare as well.
So because there was probably a brief disconnection, so I just want to repeat the question a little bit so that I can make sure. Yeah.
It has to do with text file microdata and the availability to provincial governments. And so the kind of data that might be data that comes from temporary visa data, but also IMDb data, iCare data.
Yeah, so I think that that's definitely an excellent question related to accessible data related to immigration. So right now, so StatsCan is working with like partners, for example, like IRCC and also CRA, just to first just enrich the existing data to include more text measures into the IMDb. But in terms of accessibility, so IMDb right now is already available in the RDCs. So we can make special arrangements in terms of like MOU with provincial governments in terms of data sharing and also data access. I think all this basically just takes a conversation between provincial partners and also StatsCan. So we have very, I would say, fluent models actually to adapt to different situations. And also we are very open to facilitate data access.
Mike, could I add just a quick comment on that as well? This is Ted.
Absolutely. You're a good person to answer this, I know.
Yeah. So IRCC's been really proactive in getting their microdata into the hands of researchers, both through the RDC program, where it's been linked with all kinds of data sets, including tax records and now health records, but also at the provincial level, so provincial administrative data centers like the one that I run. So for those provincial governments where they would like to have access to the data and it's been very difficult to get micro level data, that the data are there, it's just, it may be faster for them to partner with their local university or the local data center to be able to not just get access to the data, but get access to analytical capacities there as well. So we have an arrangement with our provincial government population growth division, which is basically using our data infrastructure and their policy questions to help them guide, evaluate their policy and move forward.
That's good. I should just check whether Jesselyn has anything to say on that last question, and then I will be stopping. Jesselyn, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think Ted actually covered what I was going to add.
Okay, very good. I'm done, Martin.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. And I'm sure you've got a wealth of questions there, and thank you to all those who contributed them, and we will certainly benefit from reviewing them to inform our ongoing work. So as I bring this to a close, on behalf of our network, the CRDCN and Statistics Canada, I do really want to thank all four of our panelists for their very thoughtful and action-oriented insights that they've shared with us today. And I also want to echo Ted's comments on the role of our network as the bridge between research and policy, and the fact that we are, I believe, especially well placed in addressing key issues in the context of the impacts of COVID-19, obviously working closely with our partners in that regard. I also want to thank all the participants who joined us today, and we invite you, along with others, to register for our final webinar in this series, which is on population health and health services, and that's tomorrow, May 28th, from 1 until 2 o'clock. A video recording of this webinar will be available on our CRDCN website in the days to come. So thank you all once again. Merci beaucoup et bonne journée.